Hey everyone, this is Daarken with Enlightened.com, and I wanted to go back to some more still life painting since we took a little bit of a break from it. And I wanted to continue with painting different types of materials and textures. So this time I'm going to paint a glass jar so you can kind of see how I go about painting transparent objects. And I'm going to be going over some different tools like transform and warp and distort and liquefy to try and help me get the ellipse a little more accurate, since it's kind of hard to draw ellipses in general, but especially when you're working with a tablet because of that lack of control. So right now I'm just using the round brush and I'm blocking in the dark gray shape on the top of the lid. Now I'm not really going to be doing like an underdrawing or anything. I'm just going to be drawing shapes and silhouettes, and it's all going to be direct drawing. So once I have this top area marked or blocked in, I'm going to start painting in some of the other shapes around it. And I'm also still going to keep this all in black and white because I want to focus on values at first, since a lot of people have trouble working in color anyway, and so that's just one less thing to worry about instead of having to worry about value in your drawing and your tools and how Photoshop works and all that. So we'll get into color later, and I'll talk about how to add color to black and white images as well as just starting in straight color, because it really depends on the situation. So sometimes I start in color and sometimes I start in black and white, but for this one I'm just going to keep it in black and white. So you'll notice that when I flip my image, you can kind of see that the top shape of the lid is a little bit off. So I'm going to have to go back and change that to fix it up. So yeah, I'm trying to fix this side over here. So flipping your image can be a great way to reveal your mistakes. I'm also going to select everything with the marquee tool and just rotate it a little bit. So again, flipping my image, you can still see that it's not quite symmetrical. So again, going back and trying to fix some of my shapes a little bit. And you also notice that I didn't go straight to white like it is in the reference. I like to work in a mid-tone first and then build up my way to dark and build up my way to light. That way I don't immediately start off too bright or too dark, so I can kind of work my way to both ends of the spectrum. And usually if you save, your strongest highlights toward the end, that's kind of like, the satisfaction part. It's just putting in that final highlight or the final darks. So right now I'm blocking in the cast shadow in the background to kind of pull out the shape of the jar. So you don't always have to paint the actual object. You can look for shadows and things or negative space to pull out the shape of your object. So you can see right here, by painting in this cast shadow, I'm automatically blocking in the edge of the jar itself. And I want the edge of the contour of the jar to be pretty sharp, especially since this is a hard and sharp object. But I'm also leaving the shadow a little bit loose towards the edges. So again, like with my other paintings, I'm not really thinking of this in terms of, oh, this is a lid, this is a jar. I'm looking at the different shapes that the values are creating, and then I'm just recreating those shapes in relation to all the other shapes around it. I probably mentioned the same things in a lot of these tutorials, but that's just because that's how I paint and that's my process. So now for the interior of this jar, I'm moving into the chalk brush, and I'm trying to get some larger shapes blocked in. And one of the things I noticed with some beginners is they tend to use really small brushes and kind of play around too much in certain areas. They kind of push the paint around too much, and it gets a little overworked and a little muddy. So just try using some larger brushes and less brush strokes. So again, for this right side, I'm blocking in some of the background to pull out the shape of the jar. I switched to another chalk brush that doesn't have quite as much texture. So you can see, since I already have that white, I'm going in and blocking in some of the lighter areas in the jar. I think a lot of times people tend to overlook the background. I mean, you'll notice that just by putting in a few strokes on the left and right for the background, it immediately popped my jar out from the background and made it more three-dimensional. So, if this was just a line drawing without that, I don't think it would be as bold looking. So try to remember that when you're working on your paintings. Don't just ignore the background, because backgrounds can actually help your painting a lot. So you'll notice I opened the brush controls and I'm rotating my brush so that I can get the brush to go in the direction that I want it to. So I'm painting with the direction of the shape right now. I'm just trying to block in some of these little edges, and I'm not being too precise with where they are. I mean, I'm not like measuring anything. I'm just kind of eyeballing it and seeing if it looks fairly convincing. I'll usually jump around a lot too. Like, I'm trying to paint in these little edges, but then I noticed, hey, maybe I should move into this large, darker core shadow shape over here. And then I'll notice something else, next to it that I want to block in, and I'll move over to that. Like, maybe I'll knock in some of this other shadow shape over here. And again, I'm just looking at what the shape the shadow is making. I think if I was painting this traditionally in oils or something, I would probably block out the entire shape first and then fill it in with value and shapes. But for some reason, when I'm working digitally and I'm just doing direct drawing, a lot of times I'll just work in this fashion where I go from area to area instead of blocking out the entire thing first. And I mean, I guess maybe it's because I know that you can make changes very easily in digital, whereas if you're working in oils or something, you kind of have to plan a little more ahead in order to minimize the amount of changes you have to make. Just trying to get some of the subtle value changes in here, some of the reflections and things. And again, I'm not trying to copy this exactly. I'm just trying to hint at some of the things in there. And then for this middle shape, I'm just going to use a much larger brush and just block in some values. Again, I'm not trying to mimic every single little reflection and value and everything. My goal isn't to create a identical photorealistic painting. In a way, glass is a little bit like metal in that you can have a very high range of values right next to each other. So you can have, almost black right next to something that's maybe like a 1 or 2 in the value scale. So in that sense, you can have high areas of contrast. I think one of the things about metal is a lot of times, since it's smoother, well, depending on the metal, your shapes can be a little more precise. Like if you look at the shapes in this glass right here, a lot of them are very wavy and wobbly. So that might be one thing that can set apart glass and metal. I mean, other than the fact that glass is see-through. The other thing is that when I'm painting metal, I tend to add more nicks and scratches and things, so glass is going to be a little bit smoother. So for that side edge over there, I was actually using the shift button to help me make that straight line. Again, I'm just working my way from shape to shape and blocking those in. You'll notice in the reference there's a lot of different little shapes and things going on, so I'm not trying to copy them exactly. I'm going to put in this highlight here and then maybe a few more just to get the idea across. So this painting took about 30 minutes to paint, and again, this is all filmed in real time so you can see the speed at which I paint. This area over here, there's a lot of little light areas and dark areas, and it's pretty complicated, so I'm just going to simplify it a little bit. I'm going to find this bottom edge over here, and this is a good area to have a nice sharp dark value. Just adding in that sharp dark area really pulled out the shape of the jar and kind of grounded it. I'm moving back up to the lid of the jar. I'm going to try and fix some of the shapes a little bit and pull out some of these highlights. Oh, I also wanted to point out that you'll notice that I'm not color picking anything from the reference photo. That's because I want to try and get the values myself instead of trying to rely on just color picking from the photo. Because I mean, if you're working on your own personal illustration, you're probably not going to have reference sitting right next to you that you're going to be able to color pick from. So this way it kind of forces you to see and recognize and understand values more easily. And once I have my main values established on my painting, I'm just color picking from my own painting and changing values that way. So again, I'm going back up to the top and trying to fix that ellipse of the lid. I'm going to go in and change my brush to the same angle as the lid. I'm going to start knocking in some of the lighter areas. I'm not going to go completely white like in the photo. Like the photo is pretty blown out and it looks a little flat. So I'm going to try and keep it a little bit darker and then add in some more highlights towards the center. So over here I'm just painting in the background to kind of pull out the shape of the lid. Again, it's also a good way to get some harder edges around the contour. And for these ridges on the lid, I'm just gonna, mark them in a little bit. I'm not being completely accurate. I'm not counting like how many there are or anything. I'm just knocking in a few. There are actually much easier ways to paint the ellipse on this lid up here. I mean, I could use like the marquee tool or something, but I usually just paint everything by hand just because that's the way I'm used to working. I mean, I probably should use some more shortcuts to save time, especially since I have a lot of freelance paintings I'm working on, but I usually don't think of it at the time just because I'm so used to just painting things, manually. I mean, I've gotten a little better about doing that kind of stuff, like with mountains and trees. I'm starting to use more selection tools and gradients and all that to save time. But, there's still a lot of things that I still paint by hand. Like whenever I'm painting swords, I usually paint those by hand instead of using like the line tool or the marquee tool or anything. I was watching K-Kai paint not too long ago, and I saw him use the line tool for his weapons. And at the time, I was like, "Oh man, I should be doing that whenever I paint weapons." And I still don't do that just because I'm so used to painting it by hand. But yeah, I should probably try and do that stuff more. And a lot of times, when people do that, it's not that they can't paint a sword or something. It's because they need to save time because they have so many other things that they have going on that they need to maximize their time as much as possible and be completely efficient with their paintings. As it is, I probably spend way too much time on my paintings, and it's crazy because I have so many different paintings going on at once. And it's funny too because when I'm working on personal paintings, I knock those out in like 2 or 3 hours and I'm completely done with an entire illustration. But then when it comes to freelance work, it takes me days. And I don't know. I mean, I guess it's because I'm painting something for someone else and they have different goals and ideas than I do. Like, for a personal piece, if I think something is done and it's still kind of loose in an area, then it doesn't matter. But a client may think, oh, can you go back and put a lot more detail in this area? Again, painting in the background to sharpen up the edge of that lid a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and draw in the bottom ellipse of this jar. And again, I'm just eyeballing it. Like, I probably should have drawn a straight line across to line up the corners where it connects to the sides, but I'm just eyeballing it. I mean, again, you can flip your image to kind of see if it lines up or not. So again, just marking in this area on the bottom, not being too careful about it. I'm trying to use a big brush. You'll notice I switched to the round brush too. Again, for this back ellipse, I'm just eyeballing it. I mean, I think it could have been pushed further back now that I look at it compared to the reference. But I will probably go back and fix that with the liquefy tool or something like that. Again, with this one, I'm not really going to go into painting the background or the table that it's sitting on, just because I want to save time and focus on painting the object. But I just wanted to hint at some of the values in the background to give this jar a little bit of punch. Another cool exercise to do if you're painting something that's transparent is to fill it with some kind of liquid, because then you can have liquid that you have to paint, which is a different texture and surface than the glass. And if you have something inside the liquid, then you can deal with refraction, which might be cool too. Also, when you shine light through liquid, it can do some cool stuff. So right now the bottom looks kind of blah and flat, and there's not much form to it. But then once you start adding in some of the highlights, it automatically gives it form and just makes it pop. So it's always fun when you get to that stage and your painting actually starts to come to life. And like just adding these couple little highlights, really pushes the form. And it starts to look like the actual object that it is. So for this bright highlight in the center, I'm going to switch to one of the round brushes that has no opacity. So it's coming out at 100% opacity, so there's no pen pressure or anything. And I wanted this highlight to be really sharp. I wanted it to look like it was closer to the viewer. And also, there's a little bit of a fuzzy edge to it in the middle. So I'm switching to a round brush that has opacity. I'm just lightly painting in that to give it a little bit of a fuzzy edge in some areas. So that way that single highlight can have hard and soft edges. I think for the most part I use the chalk brush just to block in the main dark areas in the background and also the darker areas of the jar. But then when I actually started painting in the highlights and some of the details and the darker shadows and reflections and things, I used the round brush. And then I will use the chalk brush again for the lid, just because if you look at the lid shape, it's kind of like rectangular, I guess. And so the direction of that chalk brush really helped me paint in that shape. And the round brush is good for painting things that are a little bit harder, I guess, because I don't have texture on it or anything. I still need to push some of the lights in the lid, so I need to go back and add some of these highlights. So adding this little rim highlight around this really pulls out the folded edge of that lid. And then towards the center I'm going to have it be a little bit brighter. I'm still having some trouble with the ellipses up here on the lid, especially the glass part right below it. So there are a few things that you can do to kind of change things around without having to repaint the entire area. And so I'm just gonna go to liquefy, since this is all on one layer anyway. And this is a great way to move things around in your painting without having to repaint entire areas. So I'm just gonna increase my brush size and then push up some of these areas just to fix the ellipse a little bit. And you'll notice that it's just pushing around the paint that's already there, so if you move something too much, it'll be really obvious that it shouldn't be in that place, so it's going to look weird. So you have to kind of do this very subtly, especially when you're trying to change the angle of something. So I'm just trying to make it look like this wraps around a little better. See, even when you move it in small amounts, you can still kind of see that it looks weird in some areas. So whenever you get that, you're just going to have to go back in and paint opaquely on top to fix it. Even on the bottom ellipse, I think I can pull that down a little bit, just to make it look like it wraps around more. Alright, so now you can see the before and after. And flipping my image again, you can still see that there's some errors a little bit, like some things are skewed a little bit. So I can always go to transform and distort. Actually, I'm going to select a smaller area to distort. I can just pull out the handlebars a little bit and move it over some. Flipping it to see if that looks better. Looking back at it now, it looks like the left side of the top of the lid goes in at an angle too much instead of going straight up and down, but it's pretty minor, and it might not be something you really notice unless you're actually like comparing it to the reference or something. Right now I pretty much have everything finished. I'm just going back and making a few little changes or adding in some details and pushing a couple little lights and darks. Like some of the areas in the middle where I just kind of simplified things when I was blocking everything in, I can go back and add in a few more details to make it look a little bit more like the reference. Like over here I can add some of the lighter reflections. There are a few areas on the bottom too that I can add in a couple more details. But other than that, pretty much finished with this painting. So again, it took about 32 minutes to paint this. And this was all real time. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching me paint this still life, and hopefully this will help you when painting transparent objects. And homework. Everyone's always asking me to assign homework in these tutorials now, which is kind of funny because people always are like, oh my god, I don't want to do homework, but now people are actually asking me to assign homework. So for this one, I want you guys to paint a transparent object in black and white, and then post your finished paintings in the forum. There should be like a glass jar thread inside the homework tutorial area, and I'll let you guys know what you guys can improve and change, and I look forward to seeing them. Thanks a lot.